Welcome to our 8th installment of Anglicans You Didn't Know You Knew. And in these videos here, I am introducing you to people or reintroducing you to people that you perhaps know by name or by some contribution that they've made to American history and American life. In each case, these have been men and women who have not only contributed to the country and been foundational to it, but they've practiced the Anglican faith. And this points to the important role that the Anglican Church has played in American history, and every American should be reintroduced to them for that reason. If you are an American, the Anglican Church and the Anglican faith play a vital role in your cultural, historical, and religious heritage, and I encourage you to consider that as an American. Today's Anglican individual we're speaking of would be George Whitefield. George Whitefield is considered by many to actually be the father of evangelicalism. Whitefield insisted that the religion that he modeled was what originated, was a straightforward application, essentially, of the Anglican faith and practice, Anglican doctrine, which is found in the Book of Common Prayer, the Articles of Religion, and, of course, the homilies. And these are essentially, you could say, the three main pillars that make up the Anglican faith and practice. So George Whitefield was one of the most dynamic and famous 18th century preachers. His eloquent oratory skills is what he's known for. Their charismatic personality as well really is what helped to spark the Great Awakening at the time. Throughout, and this is of course throughout Britain, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and interest in our case, the North American colonies as well. He's born in 1714 to Thomas and Elizabeth Whitefield in Gloucester, England. And as a boy, his parents owned a tavern and an inn. And Whitefield would work there to earn money and helped to manage the tavern and the inn. And of course, he put himself through college. He put himself through Pembroke College at Oxford University. And while he's at Oxford, he is introduced, or he meets John and Charles Wesley. You'll probably know those two by they are the founders, or considered the founders of Methodism. Whitefield is also considered a founder of Methodism as well. A lot of people don't really realize that, but he actually parted ways with the Wesleys and their movement later on because essentially he differed because of their adherence to the erroneous Arminian theological belief system. So he moves on. It's at this time, however, that Whitefield experiences, he said that this is the time, however, in my life that I really experienced a dramatic conversion. And he says, I can only describe this as a new birth. So as a boy, George Whitefield really enjoyed theater. And so he had a gift for speaking, he had a gift for acting, and it is said that he would even skip classes so that he could rehearse his performances. And so his stage experience would really play a role and serve him well as his preaching career began. His conversion, though, sets him now on a path to preach the gospel to everywhere, to preach the gospel to all people everywhere, as we are all commissioned to do. And after his ordination in the Anglican Church to the priesthood, he delivers his first sermon at age 21. So very young even as an ordained minister, never mind a preacher. Because of his style and also his confrontation that he had with other, what he would call less zealous and less committed clergy, church doors were beginning to close to him, unfortunately. So he had to go elsewhere. What does he do? He takes his message outdoors. He's one of the first of the outdoor preachers, which is very unheard of at this time. You would always be preaching in the church, in the pulpit, which is quite proper. And so he would preach multiple times a day to huge audiences. Thousands of people would come to hear him from all over the countryside, and it's reported that people were actually just hanging on every word that came from his mouth. He comes to America in 1739. This is again coinciding as the Great Awakening is also taking hold here in America. His audience are spellbound by his delivery here as well. He could bring Bible studies to life by acting out these things and acting out the stories to people so they could understand. Sometimes the crowds would get a little bit rambunctious, and reports of people sometimes getting trampled. But other times the report that the crowd was so docile and calm, and they were standing in stony silence, listening to him preach, and you could hear a pin drop. Jonathan Edwards, another major player in the Great Awakening at the time, says that Whitefield was a born orator. So he would also say, Jonathan Edwards actually would go on to say that as a prejudiced person, I know might say that this is all theatrical artifice and display. But not so will anyone think who has seen and known him. So high regard for Whitefield, and he really was convinced of Whitefield's authenticity as a preacher, though he had this sort of flamboyant acting style. He said that he's the real deal. The press would dub him the marvel of the age, which is not too bad for the press, not too hard-hitting there at all, quite complimentary, in fact. He marries Elizabeth James. She's a 36-year-old widow. He marries her, and she's from Wales, and a new convert to Christianity at the time. And she helps him on his ministry, and she would help him for the rest of her life. And she would also help at his orphanage that he founded as well. She would give birth to a baby boy in 1743, but unfortunately only 4 months later, the baby would die. Elizabeth then never had any other children. Elizabeth would minister at Whitefield's side, and she did so for another 28 years. For 28 years, she was by his side until she dies in London in 1769. George Whitefield would then go back to America once again after this, and his final sermon was preached at Boston Common, and it drew a crowd apparently of 23,000 people. His preaching career spans about 33 years or so. During this time, he travels back and forth to America and to England 7 times. He's goes to Scotland apparently 15 times. Quite a traveler. England, Wales, Ireland as well. His enthusiasm for the gospel was really always at sort of the forefront. It's what energized and motivated him, and was always at sort of the forefront of his dialogue. In fact, he says, God forbid that I should travel with anybody a quarter of an hour without speaking of Christ to them. When his health declines later on, he, as many preachers experience, people are telling him to slow down, to take it easy, relax, and of course he doesn't want to do that. He's quoted as saying, I would rather wear out than rust out. Whitefield's sermons were impressing everyone, and of all people, also Benjamin Franklin. Franklin would become friends. The two of them would become friends, and Franklin, being the entrepreneur, of course, became Whitefield's official printer. Whitefield was printing a journal at this time, a best-selling journal at this time, and Franklin was his printer. And Franklin also built a large auditorium in Philadelphia for Whitefield to preach in or preach from. Because the crowds were so massive all the time, no structure could hold this many people. So Whitefield would preach many times in this structure that Franklin built for him in Philadelphia. He used, again, no amplification, no electricity is available at this time. Whitefield would memorize his sermons. He would preach from no notes either. It's said that he's so eloquent in speech that people would literally weep when he pronounced the word Mesopotamia. People would actually swoon when he would pronounce that word. So this style of preaching and crowd reaction was really kind of the hallmark of the Great Awakening anyway. Others got this sort of the same reaction. Whitefield seemed to be kind of the crown of this period. The crowds would be so overwhelmed with emotion as well. It's said that England was utterly seized by a spiritual convulsion at this time. Whitefield, for Americans, then, we could say is his legacy of bringing the gospel message to America, but bringing it in a way that was like no other had done before, with such power, such massive numbers of converts, was really what made the Great Awakening. And it was the evangelical message that Whitefield preached in particular that gave it such power and such success. His emphasis was always on that new birth that he mentioned when he first was converted. That new birth must take place within the Christian. One was not only a Christian privately, but or even outward and inwardly, but a complete transformation, I should say, had to take place. Inwardly, outwardly, there had to be a complete transformation, and that was his message to others as well forever. The evangelical witness today in America really owes much of its origins, its life, its success, and even its style in a lot of ways to George Whitefield and from his preaching and teaching. He does have a notable quote here. He said, "A dead ministry will always make a dead people. Whereas if ministers are armed with the love of God themselves, they cannot but be instruments of diffusing that love among others." Whitefield would die at age 55 on September 30th, 1770 at Newburyport, Massachusetts, sadly. And John Wesley, however, who, again, his Methodist friend from way back, was the one who preached the sermon at his funeral in London at Whitefield's request. So John, of course, though they parted ways, John faithfully carried out Whitefield's final requests. And of course, quite fittingly, we will end with this, quite fittingly, Whitefield is buried in a crypt under the pulpit of his own church.